Okay, thank you. All right. I'm going to talk for a while as if this were actually a lecture, so I hope that works. Developmental dilemmas, power and institutional entrepreneurship, a lens for policy analysis. So why is it that well-intentioned policies so often fail? All right. We can think about the example of the peace agreement negotiated between the Colombian government and the FARC guerrillas, which at the time seemed like a good agreement, and yet dissident guerrilla factions held on to their arms, and now violence has resumed in many areas. Or we might consider the example of the privatization of former Soviet assets in Russia during the 1990s, which got followed up with the current authoritarian kleptocracy. And then, of course, we've got resource curses spread around the world in a variety of places. So what's going on here? I mean, the main thing is that powerful agents intervened. They can make rents. They have their own interests. They have their own agendas, and those agendas tend to be contrary to many of the policy intentions. So what do we do about that? So this talk, I'm going to summarize parts of the conceptual framework that I offer in my my new Cambridge book that Kunal mentioned, Developmental Dilemmas, the rule of power and agency. It refers to my other books. The first two are my Stanford books, 2013 and 2020. I was contributed to the co-authored book, Political Settlements and Development Theory, Evidence, Implications. And then I've got an article on power and public authority. So all of this stuff fits. So I'm going to address, right now I'll address the topics in order. So I'll talk a little bit about what do we mean by developmental dilemmas anyway. Then power, how can we think about power systematically? And then I'll focus on the notion of institutional entrepreneurs as a key type of agent that influence the effectiveness or failure of policy. So developmental dilemmas. Inclusive development entails resolving dense, complex collective action problems. We can think of these at two levels. The first level, which is intuitively obvious, is the notion of free riding, right? How can we provide public goods? How can we limit externalities, negative externalities? How can we limit use of common resources? In principle, parties can come up with negotiated agreements on how to share the costs and benefits of achieving cooperation. But the problem is, will they honor the agreements when it's often cheaper not to? And that's where the second order collective action problems come from. So in other words, I'd say second order collective action problem is really the problem of arranging coordination and enforcement that would make an agreement credible and therefore implementable. And second order collective action problems, I would argue, are a key foundation of political economy theory because enforcement always entails exercising power in some fashion. So how do we deal with that? How do we get around these problems? I also would argue that they are a fundamental foundation of policy failure. Institutional configurations can both resolve these problems. In fact, you almost cannot resolve them without some sort of institutional configuration, but they also create them. So it goes both ways, right? And then finally, powerful actors, of course, shape institutional evolution because they can. They want to tilt it towards their own agendas. So institutional entrepreneurs, I'm going to argue, are a key type of agent. And what they're going to work on is understandings of interests, understandings of norms, understandings of social identities. And one of the destructive things they can do is promote what we'll call singular identities, which tend to generate social cleavage and conflict. Okay, so second concept, power. Define it, if we define it on a binary level, A's power is its ability to influence the incentives and the understandings of incentives and options that party B has, and influence them in a way that's beneficial to A that B would not have otherwise taken. Okay, so we're just going to leave it. It's going to influence the trajectory of B's action. Okay, characteristics. Power is relational. I'm not talking about somebody's strength in sports or something like that. That's not what we're talking about. We're talking about a relationship. As a relationship, exercises of power tend to game theoretically represent a Nash equilibrium. In other words, the idea is that the party exercising power understands or perceives no feasible alternatives that are better than that exercise of power. And likewise, the one who submits or is co-opted or whatever also perceives no better feasible alternatives. And therefore, the relationship persists until something disrupts it. Okay? Secondly, power is normatively indeterminate, and this is often not stated. It's not a zero-sum game. In other words, you can have positive sum benefits from exercises of power. It depends, of course. It's often very exploitative, obviously. But the example would be parents exert power over their children for their well-being and health and all that sort of stuff, right? Okay, that's a positive sum game, at least in the long run, usually. Not always. But anyway. And then third, I've got the norm. Yeah, I got all that, the Nash equilibrium. We're good. Okay, now, elements of power relations. This is how I want to try to think about power systematically. So first off is, where does power come from? Fairly simple, three basic sources. One is access to resources, right? This is a point that when economists discuss resource scarcity, they've completely, not always, sometimes completely overlook its relationship to power and politics. Okay? That's why political economy, in my opinion, is more interesting than pure economics. Okay? Second, institutionally designated positions that can be informal or formal. A community leader can exercise power. The chair of a legislative committee can exercise power. Prime minister, so on and so forth, right? And then finally, resolution of organizational collective action problems. Coherent organizations can exert more power than dysfunctional ones. Okay, simple, right? Okay, now, instruments of power. Two basic types. One, direct or threatened sanctions, which can be positive or negative. Promises, threats. Okay, if you do this, I'll give you that. If you don't do that, I'll punish you. Okay. Two, manipulative communication. Okay, lying. People can often exercise power by lying to other people about what will happen. Okay. Okay, domains or faces of power from Stephen Luke's 1974. We're going to think of power one as exercising power where the rules of the game are well understood, and it just represents the strength of the force or the strength of a coalition, the bargaining power. How many troops does Russia have? How many troops does Ukraine have? How many drones do they have? And so on and so forth. That's power one. Everybody understands they're already at war. This is what's happening. Power two is manipulating access and manipulating the rules of the game. Okay, you knock your opponent's item off the discussion agenda. You limit voting by restricting voting rules and so on and so forth. That's all power two, right? Russia's invasion of Ukraine was power two in their diplomatic relationships, right? The initial invasion, that was a new change in the rules of the game, right? That's power two, very, very important. And then power three, which is deeper and sometimes more insidious, is altering the preference or influencing the preferences and beliefs of the other party about the nature of the conflict itself. In other words, A persuades B, what I'm doing is really in your interest. What's the problem? Or A says to B, a person in your position should never challenge someone in my position. Or A says to B, don't blame me, they did it. Okay, that's all power three, right? And so these are, okay, and then one final thing, manifestations, which I'm not going to say much about, but they're not trivial, is de facto power is essentially the number of troops you have on the ground, the number of people who show up at a demonstration, protest, something like that. It can be very forceful at the moment, but it tends not to last. Okay, de jure power is institutionalized. So the position of prime minister is institutionalized, and that power can persist for a while, usually. Okay. Now, I want to move the discussion of power to a triadic level. In other words, more than two parties. And so triadic power means that there are at least three poles of interaction amongst participants who differ in important respects. So instead of just thinking about labor management bargaining, think about labor management and financier. Okay? We've got at least three poles of the interaction going on there, right? And this triadic approach can more clearly demonstrate power asymmetries. And it importantly can illustrate impacts or involvement of third parties in power relationships. And I'm going to argue, and this I make in my 2020 book, that there are 7 basic formats, or what I would call strategic templates, for exercising triadic power. Okay, it's in my 2020 book and in my 2024 global policy article, and also in this current book. So what are they? Well, triadic format 1 is threatening to disrupt potential exchange with somebody else. Okay, so the example, this is from Kaushik Basu, is landlord A tells tenant laborer B that unless you accept my really low wage offer, I will disrupt your relationship with the merchant. You won't be able to buy anything. Okay? Now what does that mean? That means that B is going to accept a wage that in economic terms is below its reservation wage. It's below what would have been its next best alternative. And that is actually an economist's definition of exploitation. Okay? So that happens one company, towns, sharecropping, so on and so forth. Okay? And we can show this as a diagram. There are 6 other formats. I'll breeze through these. Format 2, using a third party to reward or punish somebody else. Obviously, authoritarians do this all the time. They don't punish people. They have the security services do that, right? 3, demanding return for taking sides. Small parties and parliamentary governments do this all the time. If you don't give us the finance ministry, sorry, we'll go with the other one, etc., right? 4, intuitive, divide and rule. Happens all the time, colonialism, all sorts of stuff, right? 5, mediate. Impartially, maybe not impartially. Okay? 6, this is a complicated one. The presence of third parties influences the power relationship between A and B, even though the third parties are not directly involved. Okay? So the best example of this is a large amount of unemployed workers will reduce the bargaining power of labor vis-a-vis management. Okay? That's format 6. Format 7, the most complicated one, is gatekeeping. That means a party limits the access to a desirable, powerful position. Okay, so some official or perhaps business person with a great deal of power can limit the entry of other firms into the market. Okay, some entrepreneurs who in principle could have started firms are not allowed to enter, right? That's limited. Okay, so that's an exertion of power over those folks. And then because of that, consumer choice in that market is limited. You can only buy from this company or that company instead of 100, right? And that dimension of this gatekeeping is what's called invisible power. The consumers may not even know who limited the number of firms or why they did it or anything about it. So it's got these elements to it which make it very interesting. So we can draw a diagram. X limits the access of powerful position A. They can exert monopoly power over B. And then there's indirect invisible power by limiting B's set of choices. Okay, it's a very interesting dynamic, actually. Okay, so those are the 7 triadic formats. Now, agency. I'm going to focus on institutional entrepreneurs, okay? These are agents, and by agents I can mean individuals, organizations, or coalitions, okay? They're actors. They can do things, okay? So, and agency means exercise of choice. So anyway, institutional entrepreneurs use narratives, actions, symbols to alter understandings, to alter prescriptions, to alter reactions, to alter norms, social norms or understandings of norms, and social identities. And in so doing, they're exercising both power 2 and power 3. They're changing the rules of the game and they're changing perceptions of conflict. Okay. They may often promote narrow, singular social identities, which I'll say more about in a minute, and that can generate social cleavages. For example, identity politics, all kinds of populism that we see sprouting up around the world right now, and developmental dilemmas, policy failure, and so forth, right? So, characteristics. They have social skills. They recognize problems. They recognize opportunities. They're willing to take risks. They deal in the meaning of social action, okay? They utilize powers 2 and 3, where agents plus power alter structure. I'll say something about that in a minute. They can alter incentives, prescriptions, information flows, norms, compatibility of norms with formal institutions, social identities. Triadic power, they may ostracize certain people, that would be the format 1. They may divide and conquer, they may mediate, they may gatekeep, and so forth. Their ability to do all of this stuff, of course, depends on their access to the sources of power, which we've been through, and also the distribution of power amongst other parties who could be involved in this. All right? They're especially important in areas with weak institutions, borderlands, areas with large stores of point source resources without strong institutional foundations and so forth, right? And they can operate as either leaders or brokers, okay? And these are two other types of agency. So what do I mean by leaders? Leaders, simple definition, a leader is a person who has a following, period. Okay? Big, small, doesn't matter. They see opportunity, they mobilize, they can change understandings. They operate as focal persons. This is another point from Patrick Basu. Well, in other words, you're in a very quickly adaptive strategic situation. How does a group decide what to do? Follow the leader. Simple. Right? The armies do this all the time, of course, right? That's how they function. So the leaders, the commanding officers, are focal persons. Everyone else focuses their strategy choice on following. Okay? They exercise power directly. They're up front. Followers obey, mimic, acquiesce. And we can think of this as an agency. It's a choice. Even when the alternative is horrible, which it often is, they still decide to do it. Okay? The leader-follower has a political dynamic. Okay? Leaders take actions. Followers evaluate and decide whether they're going to follow or not. Right? We can talk about what's called a prototypical leader. And that is a leader who shares some important identity component with potential followers, such as membership in the same ethnic group. Okay? And prototypical leaders can get away with all kinds of stuff that non-prototypical leaders cannot get away with. In other words, they can exploit their followers, materially sometimes, and be forgiven for it. Okay? Brokers, on the other hand, operate behind the scenes. Okay? They're not direct. They may exercise power, but not directly. They arrange, they mediate, they span gaps, they connect people together, they put together networks, they translate, they gatekeep, they mobilize power, the mobilization of power. They might be community leaders, they might be mid-level politicians, they might be bureaucrats, they might be religious personnel, they might be celebrities even. They can be all of these things, right? Now, all of these agents, and now I want to go down to the micro level for a minute. All of these agents we can conceive of as being boundedly rational. Okay? This is not the pure substantive rationality of economics. This is bounded rationality. And what we mean then is that people have limited cognition, obviously, right? None of us fully understands the world we live in. I mean, don't even imagine that. That's ridiculous, okay? So we have limited cognition, and exercising cognition is costly, at least in terms of time and effort, if nothing else. Sometimes other things too, okay? So we've got to combine those things. So what do? We want to take cognitive shortcuts. We want to borrow ideas, and that makes us subject to influence, subject to conformity pressure, subject to the machinations of institutional entrepreneurs, right? Okay, so a way to think about this is the notion of mental models. What are mental models? They're what they sound like. They're conceptual frameworks that consist of categories: old, young, rich, poor, black, white, etc. Right? And causal relationships. Any kind of causal relationship, right? If I'm thirsty and I drink my water, I'll be less thirsty, right? That's a simple causal relationship. All kinds of stuff. Social causal relationships, right? If you insult somebody, they won't like it, etc. Right? People share mental models. Obviously. In fact, that's exactly what I'm doing with you right now, is trying to share a mental model about how to think about this stuff, right? Now, for Denzel North, there are actually two really important types of shared mental models. Ideologies, pretty obvious that they would be mental models, and institutions, maybe a little less obvious that they would also be mental models, okay? And these are transmitted via narratives and actions and symbols and all that sort of stuff. Okay, so what do we mean? Ideology? These are visions of society with ethical content. Something about the good and bad, how troubled the current society is, sources of evil, actions people must take to remedy that evil, and so on and so forth, right? You got all of that. And they are mental models, right? They have categories. So think of a libertarian ideology. Categories. Businesses, the state. Two fundamental categories. Ethical prescription. Too much state regulation is bad for society because it reduces growth and so on and so forth. Gets rid of initiative, all that sort of stuff, right? Now, what do these ideologies do? They motivate collective action. They generate followings. They generate coalitions. They can generate change. They can motivate exercise of power and so forth. Second one, institutions. Again, shared mental models, the key target of institutional entrepreneurship we're talking about. What are institutions? They're rules of the game in society, okay? That's an easy statement. They're mutually understood behavioral prescriptions. Do this, don't do that. With generally large expected adherence. If they're not going to be adhered to, they're not institutions. Laws that aren't followed are not institutions. Okay? They can be informal, conventions and norms. I'm going to focus on social norms. They can be formal, regulations and laws. What do? Well, they motivate, they provide influence, they provide incentives, and they shape preferences to some degree. They convey information. Who gets what information? There are rules about that, right? I don't get the treasurer's report. Somebody else does, right? But most importantly, and this is missed so often, and a big critique of economics by sociologists and other people, but actually we can do this in institutional economics, they shape cognition. Okay, they shape our understandings of our society and our social roles, who we are, what we're supposed to do, what we're not supposed to do. That's all cognition. Okay? So they convey, they're shared mental models. Who can, cannot, should not, do what, wow, when, how. They help us navigate social context. You walk into, the store down the street, right? You don't have to figure out anything. You know the other people are shoppers. You know the clerk, what they're supposed to do. You know you're supposed to bring stuff to the table and pay for it with your credit card or cash or whatever, right? This is just a mix of formal and informal institutions that help us understand the social environment. Okay, even though everybody in the place is a complete stranger. We don't know anything else about them. Okay, so we can say that institutions operate as social choreographers. You can think of choreography of dance, right? The social choreographers. Quintus. So, summary. Structure, we get structure from institutions. They offer constraints and opportunities. They set the context within which agents act. And they evolve via the application of agency to structure via power. Okay? Agents, individuals, organizations, coalitions, they exercise choice. That's a definition of agency. And they're boundedly rational and use mental models, as I already said. We can think, in game theoretically, we can think of this as a pregame and a postgame, right? The pregame, you take agency power to set up a structure that establishes the context and within which, the rules of the game, within which some sort of exchange or operation or transition takes place, right? Then that current game generates an outcome. People respond to that outcome with agency, and maybe over time they create a new structure, and it goes on and on and on and on. And we can think of this as happening as with an evolutionary dynamic, an evolutionary punctuated equilibrium dynamic, where structures tend to persist for a while, and then they often just fall apart rapidly. Think of communism in Eastern Europe, 1947, 1989, 1991, boom, gone. All right, that's a punctuated equilibrium institutional dynamic. Okay, so back to institutional entrepreneurs. They operate in overlapping domains. The first one, economic, political. They can alter exchange institutions, markets, property rights, contexts, decision-making rules, positions, rights. What do we mean by property rights? Who gets the property? What does ownership mean? What rights does ownership convey? Who's allowed to get ownership? Who's not allowed to get ownership? These are all political economic rules, okay? and they can take strategic action. They can operate as modern princes, whatever. An example would be rebels along the Congo-Uganda border have transformed the economic and political institutions by negotiating protection for certain cross-border traders. In other words, they set up the regulatory framework. They were political institutional entrepreneurs. Okay? Second area, influence on existing norms. We've got social norms out there. Take a simple social norm. A social norm, by the way, is a behavioral prescription with ethical content. Do this, don't do that. If you do that, you're, quote, bad in some sense. If you do this, perhaps you're, quote, good in some sense. All right? So a typical example that I use for my students is cutting in a queue at a theater line, right? You're not supposed to do that. That's a bad thing to do, right? But these norms are open to interpretation, the scope of application. To whom does it apply and when? We know that the cutting a queue does not apply to 3-year-olds, right? Doesn't apply to them. Does it apply to teenagers? I don't know. Does it apply to friends? Does it apply to college professors in a lunch line at a university, or only to students? Institutional entrepreneurs can manipulate those boundaries sometimes, right? What's the intent? What are you supposed to do? What are you not supposed to do? Well, you're not supposed to cut. What does cutting mean? And, you know, if you join your spouse, is that cutting or not? And so forth, right? And then there's the deontic strength. How bad is it if you violate the norm? Is it just sort of a minor infraction? Just, that's weird. Or, you know, people can get violent over violations of social norms, right? We see all kinds of horrible things that go on in various places because somebody violated what somebody else thought was an important social norm. Okay? So again, these are subject to manipulation by institutional entrepreneurs or interpretation by institutional entrepreneurs. So they're going to impact expected reactions, conformity, pressure. Well, I'll have a diagram on that later, which I might get to. Internalization of norms. People follow the norms they internalize even if nobody notices because they feel guilty if they violated them. On the other hand, if they haven't internalized them, maybe they violate them now and again, but they're worried about what other people think. Okay, so that all goes on with norms. They can also, institutional entrepreneurs can influence the evolution of norms fairly, you know, discredit existing norms that they don't like, exploit fragilities in existing institutions, which they can do in institutional configurations. They might publicly violate the norm as a leader or as a broker. They might arrange for somebody else to do that. Okay. They can introduce new behavioral prescriptions. They can demonstrate as leaders or get other people to demonstrate as brokers. Okay. So an example would be in South Sudan, newer prophets have, quote, defined the moral boundaries of acceptable violence, conferring and withdrawing legitimacy to political leaders. Okay. So they are actually acting as normative institutional entrepreneurs in that setting. Right? Okay. Exerting a fair amount of power, right? Who's allowed to exert violence, who's not? That's a big deal. Okay, now the fourth area, and the most important really for this talk, actually, which I better get up with fast, is social identity. So at an individual level, a social identity is a concept of self in relation to others, right? Where do I stand in relation to other people? It's a mental model, okay? There's categories, there's me, there's other people. I fit in this category, you fit in that category, so on and so forth, okay? Social identities are partially chosen and partially socially constructed or socially imposed, depending on the situation. So an example I give to my students, I identify as a professor, right? That's partially chosen. I went to graduate school. But it's also partially socially imposed. I did not create any of the codes of conduct on what professors are supposed to do or not do. I didn't create any of that stuff. So that part of my identity, the social norms that apply to that identity, come from somewhere else. Okay, and we can say they're formed from strategies, identities of others, characteristics, norms. That little upside down triangle there is distributional conflict, which I'll get to later. They're individual and shared mental models. You can think of identities as social access. Okay, right? This is an economist thinking about a social concept as an asset. We use them to navigate complex social environments, all right? There are individual and group identities. Broadly speaking, there are two types, and this really matters. They're relational identities, which are formed on the basis of relationship. Who do I meet? How do I interact with them? Who do I know at work? What do I do with them? Do I go to parties with them? All that sort of stuff, right? That contributes somewhat to my identity. They're role-based, okay? They adapt quickly. And then there are categorical identities. What groups do I belong to? These tend to be impersonal, right? I belong to the group of professors, right? Okay, that's a group. It's a large amalgamated group, impersonal group, right? Often these have to do with race, gender, ethnicity, religion, and so forth, right? They are generally socially constructed and ascriptive. They may relate to your appearance, you know, what's your skin color, what's your accent, what language do you speak, that sort of stuff, right? There are three important things that can follow from these interactions: externalities, affiliations, and resource conflict. So identity externalities is from Akerlof and Cranton, by the way. Somebody's action makes an impact on somebody else's comfort with their sense of self. That's an identity externality. It can be positive, it can reaffirm their identity, or it can be negative. It can challenge or undermine their identity. So this often involves comparisons within or between groups. So an example would be a woman gets a job on an all-male construction site. Some of the men feel their identity as a male construction worker is somewhat challenged by her appearance. Okay, possibility. I actually know an example of this, but I won't go into it. The problem with this sort of identity externalities is they're often zero-sum games. You know, you can improve one person's lot in this interaction by diminishing the other ones. This is short-term. There may be long-term solutions to this sort of thing. But in the short term, they're often rather in zero-sum games, which makes the politics extremely difficult. They generate collective action problems, and obviously they're terrain for exercising power. Ostracization, format 1, divide and rule, format 4, gatekeeping, format 7. Okay. Second, affiliations. Does person belong to group X or group Y? Partially chosen, partially socially imposed, right? I belong to the group of American citizens. I didn't choose that. I was born there. Okay. On the other hand, again, partially chosen to be a college professor and so forth, right? Choices may depend on things like social distance. I'm actually quite comfortable socially with being a professor. Okay? That's sort of a nice privilege that I enjoy, having grown up with my father being rather academic and so forth. Okay. And then also maybe something about effective status, which depends on distribution of resources, which group has more status, which group has less status. Institutional entrepreneurs can obviously influence all this stuff. Understandings of interests, understandings of identities, what they do and do not mean. This brings us to group social identities. Okay? These are commonly held perceptions of group characteristics and proclivities. They may be positive, they may be negative, or anything in between, right? They tend to be some unequal sum of individual impressions, where the weights of these sums may well depend on distribution of power. Who really has the most say over how we interpret this stuff? There's a co-evolution between individual and group identities, right? Group affiliation, I'm part of this group, that affects my individual identity. Identity externalities, my activity, that may affect the group's social identity, okay? We can think of group identities as collective property, okay? Again, it's a type of informational asset that translates individual characteristics into social relationships. And group identities tend to generate group identity norms. What you're supposed to do, right? There's norms for what college professors are supposed to do. Some of that's just social norms, some of it's regulation, right? Obviously, institutional entrepreneurs then can exercise both power 3, influencing beliefs of conflict, and power 2, altering rules of the game around these issues, around these understandings, around these perceptions, around these definitions. So, stratification economics, something I recommend to people who are economically inclined, developed by William Darity and colleagues.
I Are there 5 or 10 minutes?
5 minutes? Okay, I got to run through. Okay, so lots of collective action stuff here. Comparisons, race, ethnicity, gender, caste, etc. We can have dominant and other groups. Resource conflict can be very important in this. Okay. Resource conflict. We can think of resources, wealth, land, point source, position, information access platforms, etc. Status is going to influence that. I'll take one of these quotes. Competition over material resources lies at the heart of persistent group affiliation attachment. Okay, there's 2 other quotes, but I'll skip them. This is really important. Plural versus singular identities by Amartya Sen. Okay, plural identities are primarily relational. They're evolving, they're multifaceted, they're responsive. They often involve many categories: religion, ethnicity, occupation, attachment to sports clubs, etc. Right? You can have all of this stuff in there. Singular identities, on the other hand, focus on a single ascriptive category. It might be race, it might be gender, it might be ethnic group, it might be religion, so on and so forth, and elevate that category above the other categories. The other ones don't matter. This is who you are. Okay? So they reduce the salience of within-group comparisons, such as social class. Conflict tends to focus attention on singular identities, as we see happening in many places of the world right now, right? Ukraine didn't really have that big an identity before Russia invaded it. Now they've got a strong identity, a strong group identity. Restrict your group norms, perceived absence of choice about our identities, descriptive misrepresentation of the universe of plural and diverse classification that shapes the world in which we actually live, the illusion of a singular identity that others must attribute to the person to be demeaned. That group is lazy. Right? You belong to that group. Therefore, you are lazy. All right? So that's all categorical singular identity. Institutional entrepreneurs, and we see multiple examples of this, right? This group prejudice, I'm going to skip this. This is sort of interesting, but I'm going to skip it. That's fairly obvious. Symbolism, they can use symbols. These are very interesting quotes, which I'm also going to skip. We can think, we can be more formal. We can write functions. What's interesting here, actually, I want to focus on this for a small second, is we can think of the group identity as a weighted sum of a fundamental characteristics such as ethnicity and race, and everything else, occupation, parenthood, all that stuff, right? All the other stuff is in there, right? And then the question becomes, singularity means that the weight on the ethnic race or whatever we're talking about component becomes incredibly strong. In other words, that's the thing that's salient in the mental model of identities, of the group identity. Okay, and then we can say the salience of this ethnic racial identity depends on a bunch of other stuff. What other people do, what social norms are, and then that upside down triangle, distributional conflict. Okay, so then we can say we can have dominant groups, other groups. We can take distributional ratios and say that the salience of this singular identity is going to depend on distributional ratios. A particularly important one that's operational in many places of the world is distribution of land. This is our land. This is our heritage. This other group doesn't belong here. Okay, well, the other group doesn't agree, right? Problem. Okay. Of course, institutional entrepreneurs can interpret all of this stuff. They can manipulate this stuff. That leads to social cleavage. We could write a function for it if we really wanted to. Singularity, salience, they reinforce group norms. You could think of a tipping point when the salience of the group social identity becomes so powerful. That's when your social conflict, your social cleavage starts to accelerate. Okay, we can see entrepreneurs, right? Slobodan Milosevic in Serbia, with his discussion of heritage of the Serbs going back to the 1600s, some battle whose name I don't remember, using that as a reason to go after the Muslims in Bosnia. And he managed to motivate people to do that. Okay, just these stories about heritage. Institutional entrepreneurship, destructive institutional entrepreneurship par excellence. Todman did the same thing in Croatia, etc. Okay, there we go. We can write some simple games. They're kind of fun to play with if you like that stuff. And there's another conformity pressure game. Macro context, I'm not going to say much about this because it's been done so many other places. But political settlements really say something about the macro context within which all of this stuff operates. How coherent is the configuration of political power? How inclusive is the social foundation of the political settlement? Since I'm out of time, I think I'm going to just leave it at that. Conclusions then. Well, if we want to do policy, we've got to think about all this stuff, right? What do I think? Who are the institutional entrepreneurs? What's their sources of power? What is the consistency of a policy prescription with prevalent existing social norms? Okay? If it violates those social norms, it's going to be difficult. Maybe not impossible. And sometimes we want to violate those social norms. But the more it violates social norms, the more we're going to have to resort to coercion to get the thing to work. If it follows the social norms, don't shoplift. You don't have to enforce that one very much in many places, right? Not a lot of enforcement. There's bits and pieces, right? Teenagers and stuff, but not that much enforcement. Distributions of power, everything to do with it, right? Institutional entrepreneurs, singularity, watch out for that. Political settlements. I think the thing is, well, what about inclusive development? Institutional entrepreneurs, I've talked totally about the negative side of it. You can flip it and talk about the positive side of it. Positive, functional institutional entrepreneurs can think about, well, what are problems that we can actually address? How can we assemble a coalition around this? How can we reinterpret some of the understandings of interest? How can we reinterpret the understandings of what cooperation can or does do? And so on and so forth. So you can have, obviously, there's plenty of positive institutional entrepreneurs around the world, right? Lots of NGOs try to do that with varying degrees of success, but often that's what they're trying to do. Okay, and so the point is policy analysis needs to pay attention to these questions. And if they don't, they're likely to get into this failure of well-intentioned policy. So I think I'll leave it at that because I'm probably out of town anyway.
All right,
Time anyway,
yeah.
right?
Thanks.
Okay.